The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this morning's webinar, where we'll be looking at some good practices and best practices for getting correct result of an IFC out of Autodesk Revit. So first and foremost, I do hope you're all keeping well and you are all safe. Obviously, very specific circumstances we find ourselves in at the moment, but on the bright side, more time with our family and friends, as long as we're in the same house. The sun is shining, but we can't go out and make the most of it apart from a bit of exercise once a day. But we're getting through it together, and that's the main thing. We're finding ways to work from home, collaborate from home, putting on more sessions like this, which has been great from my perspective to be able to share more content with you guys. So just quickly before we start, if I can just make sure everyone can hear me, if you just use the bar on your right hand side to stick your hand in the air, there'll be a button that says raise hand. Perfect. Thank you, Eamon. Thank you, David. That's great. So I'm going to turn my webcam off. I thought I'd just put it on for the intro. Hello. But you don't want to be looking at me while I'm staring down at my screen. So I'll turn the webcam off and we'll just jump straight in. So it's a short session today, half an hour. So I'm not going to do any PowerPoint. I've purely got the PowerPoint screen up just to have something there as a backdrop to this introduction. The session is being recorded, so it will be up on our YouTube channel at some point, either later today or later on in the week. Everyone's on mute due to the amount of people on the call. So if you have a question, please use your panel on the right-hand side. You go to webinar panel, you'll be able to write a question, and when we get to the end, I'll do a quick Q&A if time permits. But without further ado, let's just literally just jump straight into Revit and just start talking through kind of the purpose behind this webinar, really, and why I wanted to put this one together. So obviously, when we're working with digital construction or building information modeling, and we are producing our buildings and collaborating on a project, it's not uncommon, and it's pretty standard nowadays to be asked for an IFC file, industry foundation class. Now, Revit has functionality to produce those IFCs. Brilliant, great. It works well, but there are some do's and don'ts. There's some unknown facts, and there's some things that you need to be really careful of to make sure that what you're actually producing makes sense, is viable, and is actually correct to a certain extent. And what I want to do for the next sort of 20 minutes or so is try and explain some of that and go through it in real layman's terms. We're all sat working from home in the most part. Some of us may have a little bit more time than normal, so this is something that you can hopefully take on board, practice it, and then put it into effect on your next project. So I'm using Revit 2020. This process is pretty much commonplace now for certainly all of the supported version of Revit, so 2021 and 3 versions back, but also prior to that as well. And the first thing really to point out is to make sure that you are running the latest exporters for Autodesk Revit. So quite simply, bar 2021, because that's only just been released, you have a little shopping cart button at the top right. If you hit that, it will take you through to the Autodesk App Store for Revit. And what you want to do is do a little search for the word IFC, and it will give you some hits. Now, again, there's nothing for 2021 yet because that software's only just been released, so it'll probably be a number of weeks or months or so before we start seeing the 2021 IFC exporters. But the first thing you want to do is jump on here. You notice there are several pages. Find the version of the exporter that's relevant for your version of Revit and download it. Be wary, these add-ins, whilst they're free, they can update a number of times throughout the year. So don't expect that I downloaded it this time last year, so it'll be fine. You might find it's been updated a number of times throughout that year. So it's worth checking, every month or every couple of months to make sure that you've got that latest version on there. And what that does is it just gives you some more support or some more best practice with regards to the IFC export. So the first thing I want to do is just talk through why it's important to understand what the exporters are doing. And the best way to do that is just literally go via a live demo. So for the purpose of this, I'm going to be really transparent and just keep everything nice and fresh. So I've got a completely plain out-of-the-box Revit family. I'm just going to draw an architectural object. I really don't care what it is. I'm going to draw a wall. I'm going to draw a MEP object. Again, I don't care what it is. I'm just going to put a duct in for this particular scenario. Let's just change my offset to 500 so I can see it on my view. And then structurally, maybe I want to come in and place, I don't know, a beam. And again, yeah, that's fine. Let's just draw a beam like that. Head over into my 3D view, and we have an architectural element, an MEP element, and a structural element. Fine, okay? Nothing specific so far. But actually, what I want to show first of all is that we need to be really careful with how we're exporting IFCs. So I have a multidiscipline file in front of me because it contains architectural elements, MEP elements, and structural elements, albeit very, very simple. Now, if I leave everything out of the box and just say File, Export, and go and export IFC, just imagine for a second while I save this that you are the architect on a project and maybe you've done some copy design, not copy design, sorry, that's an inventor term, copy monitor, and you've copy monitored some of the structural design, absolutely you would have done. You've copy monitored some of the MEP design, absolutely you would have done. What that means is within your projects, you will have components that are architectural, MEP, and structure, because that's what Copy Monitor does. It takes a copy out of those discipline-specific files and it puts those objects in yours. That means that if you leave the settings as default, or don't be careful about the settings at least, when you export your IFC, I'm just going to use Celibri for the purpose of opening my IFC, so it's something that's non-Autodesk specific, so you can see the round trip. If I just open up that IFC that I've just exported as an architect, you'll notice that that IFC contains a wall, a duct, and a beam, as you would expect, because that's what's in my file. But this is where you need to be really careful. If you imagine this was a federated model and I had my architectural design linked in with a structural design, and I'd again used Copy Monitor, I would have those structural elements in my file. Therefore, if I export my IFC without being careful, my file as an architect would have all of my architectural design in there, and it would also have whatever structural elements I copy monitored. If I'm federating inside of Navis, inside of Celibri, inside of Tekla BIMSci, anything like that, then my model would have duplicate elements from the structural model, which means you're going to have a load of clashes that don't actually exist. You're going to have a load of duplicates that don't actually exist. We need to be really careful that we're really thinking about what we're exporting in the IFC so that they are a good quality export from our model, not including things that aren't meant to be there. So I want to talk about how we would first go ahead and fix that problem. So if we go up to File, if we go down to Export, scroll right down to the bottom, just hover over this little down arrow here, and you get some options. If we go over the options, we have very specific IFC options. And in here, we get a simple table with 3 columns. First thing to point out is we have a load and save button on the right-hand side. So we have the ability to save our export settings and load them back in. Typically, you'll probably create a number of them and use them company-wide. But this is the first thing that we need to go through. So on the far left, we have a Revit category. So that's every single category of Revit objects. So we have a wall, we have an air terminal, we'd have mechanical equipment, we'd have ducts, cable trays, beams, columns, you name it. Okay, so everything that exists as a component inside of Revit will be displayed on the left. Then what we have is we have an IFC class name. So that points to what entity you are exporting into the IFC. So the IFC is a third-party file format. It's an open file format. So, you know, a floor in Revit isn't going to be a floor in the IFC. It's going to be an IFC slab. So this here says that a floor inside of Revit, let's actually find a floor rather than a mass floor. A floor inside of Revit is going to go through as an IFC slab. Okay, that could be further categorized by this IFC type. Now, inside of IFC, these are known as enumerations or subtypes. So, for example, a flexible pipe will go out as a pipe, but if it is a flex pipe, it will be a flexible segment. If it isn't, it will just be a standard segment. Same with ducts. A flex duct would go out as an IFC duct, but specifically subcategorized as a flexible segment. Now, you'll notice that, again, I've given the example that I'm an architect here. So I have structural elements and MEP elements that are exporting. The first thing that you want to do if you are purely only exporting architectural data, if you're an architect and you want to make sure that this doesn't export anything that you are not responsible for. So ducts, pipes, cable trays, anything like that that you are not responsible for in the project, you want to change to not exported, to make sure that anything that you do have copy monitored isn't going to come out as a duplicate when it gets exported to IFC. So this is all out of the box, standard Revit. But literally you would come in here and you'd say, okay, well, I'm an architect. I don't want to export air terminals. So you would just change that to not space exported and hit return. That just tells the IFC exporter to completely ignore that specific category of object. Therefore, it wouldn't get exported in your IFC. Perfect. There's no room for human error there. It just means it won't get exported. We'll come on to some different options around that later. So that's the first thing you want to do, is go through that list and make sure that anything you're not responsible for is changed to not exported. The other thing you want to do is just sanitize what's already in there, because you might be surprised at some of the settings. For example, if you want to see your grids inside of an IFC, by default grids won't get exported. So you would need to change grid to IFC grid rather than not exported. And that would make sure that any grid lines that you've got in there come across into the IFC, which helps in collaboration and coordination inside of products like Navis or Celebri, so on and so forth, if you're using the IFC format. So that's the first thing you really want to be careful of, is firstly identifying that every Revit category goes out as an IFC class, and each IFC class could have several different IFC types to subcategorize them. So that's the first thing. Now, a number of you are probably sat there thinking, okay, great, but actually, what does that mean? What does that mean to me? I don't understand where I get that data from. So that's the next thing I want to touch on. Now, obviously, we're going through this pretty quickly because we've only got a limited amount of time today. But we have more detailed versions of this session that we run actually as an entire course, which in the current situation, in the current circumstances, we can run that in virtual classroom if you want to know that in more detail. But if I just jump onto the web, you have these technical documentations for each version of IFC. They're not the best web pages in the world, unfortunately, but typically most of you will be using IFC 2x3. So we have a home page or a technical document page for IFC 2x3, and you've got the same thing for IFC 4. Don't assume that those two versions of IFC are the same, because they're not. I'll explain that in a bit more detail in a second. So if we just use IFC 2x3, which is pretty much standard what most people are using, and if I just say, let's go into my alphabetical listings here on the left, and I'm going to come down and just look at an alphabetical listing of entities. Now, let's take another example. Let's find a boiler in here. So I'm just going to do a text search for the word boiler. He says, 2 seconds. Alphabetical listings, entities, boiler. So down here, you'll notice that we have IFC boiler. Okay, so we can specify a boiler inside of an IFC. If I come across into my lovely, very detailed Revit model and go across to systems and go to mechanical equipment, here lies a further problem. So we don't have a boiler that we place in Revit. We use mechanical equipment. For MEP designers out there, we have a number of things that we just place as mechanical equipment. And that poses the next problem. Because in Revit, I can absolutely come down and say, brilliant, I've got plumbing. I want to go to MEP. I don't know if I've actually got a boiler in this default one, but we'll just use a water heater, and we'll just use one that looks like a boiler. There we go. Hot water, open that up, and I'm just going to go ahead and place that. Now, we will put our imagination hat on again and say, well, there's my boiler. Lovely, it's great. Okay, MEP component that could be federated in. We could attach a load of level of information, level of detail in there. This might even be one that you've downloaded from a resource on the internet, whether it's the MBS, whether it's BIM object, or another resource out there on the internet. Now here lies the next thing we need to be careful of. Again, if I say File, if I say Export and I choose IFC, leave everything as default, go over the top of what's already there, jump back into my IFC viewer and just re-import that back in, you'll notice that that boiler comes in absolutely fine. But if I select that boiler, it doesn't know what it is. It's just an object. And this is another issue with these exports from a native application to an IFC, is that that synchronization of you've got object A and it has to export to object A inside of that IFC file, it doesn't always know what it's doing. And again, the reason for that is that same dialog box I showed you before. If you go all the way down to the bottom and look at your IFC export options, you don't have a boiler inside of Revit. The only category that you have that we place those components on is mechanical equipment, and it's literally one line. The only thing we can do is export that one line out to a single object. IFC building element proxy is literally a dumb object. It's an unclassified generic object that sits inside the model. And you'll notice if you scroll this list that there are a number of those in that list. So that's another job, is making sure that you have as little of those as possible, and where you've got something that is specific, like, I don't know, mechanical equipment, for example, it goes out as a more specific object rather than just a building element proxy. But actually, this example that I'm showing here is a larger issue in its own right. And the reason for that is I may have placed a VAV unit, an AHU, a boiler, a chiller, whatever it might be, and I've only got one category that I can control. So I would never be able to say a boiler is a boiler, a chiller is a chiller, an AHU is an AHU. I'd never be able to do that. So that's where I need to start being specific at item level. Now, the benefit here is most stuff that you download from reputable sources, like the MBS, for example, has this next step done for you. But if you're not, if you're using generic custom content or custom content from somewhere else, you need to be careful. So what I can do is I can control at item level how things are exported. This helps you define subcategories. So if I take a cable tray and I want to differentiate between a ladder and between a standard tray, I can use item level exports to say it's a ladder or it's a tray, using the same functionality that I'm about to show you with this boiler. You can even go as far as to do things like, okay, well, I've got a curtain wall panel, but that panel's actually a door, or it's actually something else that isn't just a generic curtain panel. Again, you can, at an item level, override what it is so that it exports correctly into the IFC. It means that anyone that's using that IFC to produce ITOs, produce standard takeoffs, or do anything like that with, it's going to give them a better quality result. So I'll do everything at project level for this example, but you could also do this at family level as well. So I'm just going to go to Manage. I'm going to go up to Project Parameters, and I'm just going to add a couple in. They need to be project parameters, and they need to be type parameters, not instance. And the first one is IFC export. IFC export as, without any spaces. Okay. It doesn't really matter where you put it, but I like to be specific. So it's common, it's a piece of text, and I'm going to put it under IFC parameters. Okay, so you've got IFC export as. We choose what we're going to have that against. I'm just going to be lazy and put it against everything and press OK. I'm going to add a new one, and I'm going to call it IFC export type. Again, it's a type parameter. Again, it's a piece of text, and I want to put it under IFC parameters and check it against everything. Now, this step is very well documented on the internet, for example. So if you go to Google and search Revit IFC export as, for anyone that likes a step-by-step, we can literally come onto the Autodesk knowledge base, and we've got step-by-step going through the exact same process that I'm doing here. So we've got a number of different routes in here. My apologies, that's not the right page. Let me correct myself. There we go. we can just do a little search and it will come in here and it will show us exactly what we need to do, what we need to name them, so on and so forth. So we've got that in there if you need it. But in this case, really easy, 2 parameters. If I then go to my boiler and look at my type properties, scroll down, I have IFC export as and IFC export type. These, by the way, will override what you have inside of here. So IFC export as, IFC export type. Okay. So all we need to do then is use this this lovely web page to figure out what this is and if it has a subcategory. So again, we're limited on time, so a couple of examples. So firstly, I'm just going to open IFC boiler type in a new tab. So we can export it as an IFC boiler type, which will try and give it a couple of property sets, so on and so forth. You'll notice that IFC boiler type has these enums, enumerations. I don't want to get too technical today. Again, we have very specific courses that really go into the back end and the technicalities of this. But if we come in and just open up the enums in their own folder, you'll notice that we have subcategories to define exactly what this is. Okay, so what this means is I'm just going to be lazy and do copy paste. So I'm going to copy into my boiler. I'm going to say you are IFC export as an IFC boiler type. And I will subcategorize this to give you the example as a water boiler. Not all objects in IFC have these enumerations. For your reference, they don't always have a subcategory. So if they don't have it, you don't specify it. If they have it, you do specify it. Let's apply that. Press OK. And then I'm just going to do the same thing. File, export, out as IFC, over the same file, same settings. Say yes. Go across into Solibri or any other IFC viewer. Once again, we're going to update our model. Say update. The first thing you'll notice is it's now a different color. So it's not just a standard gray anymore. So you know that in my case, Solibri has picked it up. If I open it, it knows it's a boiler. Okay, and not only does it know it's a boiler, it knows that it's a water boiler. It's not a steam boiler or whatever else it might be. So just by changing that one thing, we've now told a completely separate application, this is a boiler. That might tell that separate application it needs to be treated differently from a validation perspective or a takeoff perspective or a clash perspective, whatever it might be. So something that's really small, but if you're not careful, all of your IFCs that you export will have duplicate objects. They'll have components that shouldn't be in there because you're MEP and it's got a load of ceilings, walls and floors in there. It might be that you've got a load of generic objects rather than specifically having boilers, AHUs, VAVs, whatever it might be. So please be careful and really go through that process and check it. So that's kind of the biggest thing that people need to be cautious and careful of in an IFC, is that those objects are not subcategorized correctly. It's quite a big job, if I'm honest. It's a very big job to go through and make sure that those generic export settings are correct, and you also have the per object correct. Per object will override the generic, okay? So just be wary. You also need to be careful because those per object ones can do complete overrides. So for example, you could send out a roof as a completely different object. You could say a wall is a door. You could say a door is a window. So just be careful. Make sure your settings are correct. Check the objects that are coming in, and then that will give you a better output at the end of it. So that's the main part of what I wanted to share with you today, is that you've got those classification mappings that are really, really important. A couple of other little bits that I just want to share with you. And really based on time, it's just one more thing. But if we go to export an IFC, please be very careful when you modify your setup against any IFC. So IFC has set model view definitions or set rules in how geometry should or shouldn't be exported, how information should or shouldn't be exported based on these configurations, which are why if you go into them, for the most part, you can't change things. There are a number of very useful options in there, which again, in our more specific course, we go into in a lot more detail. But for the purpose of today, I just want to go through a couple just to really drive this home. So I'm just going to create a new setup, call it setup 1. And then in setup 1, I'm just going to say this is based on 2x3 coordination view 2. Couple of things in here, just to be really specific. Many of you tick this box: export Revit property sets. Okay, let me show you what I have in my IFC at the moment against any of these objects. What I have is really clean. It's minimal. We only have the piece sets that are required against the components that we have in the model. We don't necessarily have all of the Revit data. That means the IFC is cleansed on export. It does what it's meant to do. If you're not careful, just coming in and saying, oh, you know what, export every Revit property set. Let's just export that out as project2_B so we can do a comparison. This is a very small file that I have here. It's 4 components. But if I just show you that we do have, against project 2, my original, we have 600K. And against project B, we have 636. Minimal, okay, absolutely minimal. But you imagine this is an IFC that's a few hundred megabytes or even some gigabytes. That jump in file size is going to be huge, especially if you've got more components in there. If I go and jump into my IFC, let's just remove that one and, oops, I don't want to save it, sorry. Let's just remove that one and then add in project B. Against all of those components now, I will have an obscene amount of properties against every single object. Again, this is just a plain object model here, completely out of the box, but I'll have every single Revit piece of data, every single Revit property set, and in most cases you won't need all of them. So just be careful. Check your EIRs, check your BEPs, and identify what you're being asked for and make sure that that's what you're exporting. You're not putting stuff in there for the sake of putting stuff in there and overloading the models for the sake of it. One thing that's really nice and overlooked is the ability inside of Revit to create custom property sets. And I'm just going to do that really quickly using a schedule. So in Revit, again, it's a very dumb model I've got here, but if I go to View, if I go to Schedules and just do a quick multi-category schedule here, let's call this pset_Robin, press OK, and then I'm just going to add, I'm going to be lazy and just add everything into there. So for every object in my model, I will have some stuff. If I now export to IFC, make sure I'm on a view, export to IFC, go into my modify setup. Rather than exporting all of my Revit property sets, I can say, do you know what? Only export the ones that I want to. So use schedules as property sets, but only export those containing one of these words in the title. That way, I have complete control through a visible, editable, usable Revit schedule, what objects have what properties in the model, and when I get across into my IFC, if this is required or relative, I can then have a very specific property set against make sure I open the right IFC would be good. There we go. We have a nice clean takeoff as we had before, but now we have a custom property set with whatever properties you defined inside of Revit. And really today, that's kind of all I wanted to share. There's a lot more to it. It's kind of a massive beast that you really need to understand, but please don't think just by saying file export IFC, you're getting a fantastic quality IFC. There's some things you need to do in the interim to make sure that you are getting that good quality output. Hopefully in today's short session, I've given you an appreciation of that and an understanding of what that looks like and how you might start to get around it. But if this has been of interest, we do offer a very specific, detailed technical session with theory and hands-on, which in the current climate we can run via virtual classroom on Amazon Web Services. Then obviously get in touch. But I hope that's been useful this morning. I'm going to go and have a little look at the questions bar now. So for those of you that haven't asked or don't want to ask any questions, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us, and the session will be on our YouTube channel either later today or later on in the week. With regards to the questions, I've got a few. I'll stay on for a few minutes answering these. So what is the added value of subtypes? So it's a good question, Stephen. To be honest, it depends on what you're doing with the IFC on the other end. So if I was using Celebri, for example, and I was using that to have a custom classification, which is sorting out my objects and doing stuff with my objects, it would allow me to say, okay, go and find all of my ducts. Once I've got all of my ducts, go and say, what's a rigid duct? What's a flex duct? Go and find all of my doors. Go and then find all of my doors with hinges. Go and find all of my revolving doors, sliding doors, so on and so forth. It's just a way in which we can maybe do something else with the model further down the line. So in my opinion, it's useful to have in there. It's very little input. But actually it's the main entity that's the main issue, is making sure it's not going out as a generic object and that it is going out as a very specific component, let's say. So that's that one. I have a question from Jacob. Morning, Jacob. Yes, the webinar is recorded, and yes, it'll be on our YouTube channel shortly. Pavel, good morning, Pavel. May you show the workflow for IFC4? The process is the same, Pavel. If I just jump into my web browser, you just need to be careful. And the reason you need to be careful is you're going to need to do a number of different things based on IFC4. So what you see here in IFC2, we have 653 entities in IFC2. If I jump into IFC4, you'll notice that we have more entities because it's a newer file format. So there'll be things that are further refined or further defined. That's the wrong page, IFC4 documentation. So the reason we need to be careful is if I go into my alphabetical listings and go into my entities, we have 776. So clearly there are things defined by 4 that aren't in 2x3. So if you set your Revit up to work with 4, but then you need to export 2x3 for a project, it's not going to give you the desired results. So typically you just want 2 setups. The process is identical for what you do in Revit. So you define the type and the class, the type and the subcategory to be more specific. But you need to have 2 setups, one for 2x3 and one for 4. Hopefully that answered that question. Okay, so that's all the questions that I have in the list. If we do have any more questions, I'm going to stay on for another minute or so to see if any more pop in. But again, thank you very much for joining this morning. I do hope that's been useful. Obviously, we're all in this together. Got another 3 weeks of isolation. We are doing regular webinars like this, both in our AEC team and our MFG team, as well as YouTube Lives every Monday morning. So please keep us up to date. Please look at our LinkedIn, join us on LinkedIn, subscribe to us on YouTube, and we're trying to give you as much free content as we can whilst we're in this lockdown phase. So once again, thank you very much for joining. It doesn't look like we've got any more questions, so I will end the session. Stay safe, enjoy the time with your family, enjoy the sunshine in the garden, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you very much.